Hi, I'm Axel Howerton, author, publisher, editor, all the things. I started out in horror. I'm best known probably for crime, noir, thrillers, but I also write an urban fantasy series, and I am the editor-in-chief and publisher behind Coffin Hop Press, which also does quite a bit of weird fiction, some of which falls under that urban fantasy banner.
No, god damn it, you. I'm looking at the Asenath grimoire right now. Devil slumped into his favorite chair and reached out to the side table for the drink he'd left there, taking a sip and setting it on his lap. Well, is it Azathoth or is it Azagthoth? Yes, there's a fucking difference. We'll have Carl look for it then. I'm sure he's not doing anything productive.
Hi, I'm Timothy Bateson. I'm a blogger, author, and urban fantasy aficionado. And if you've never seen any of my photos, I'm also a massive fan of falconry.
Shapeshifters often wore loose clothing, but my mother had been buying from thrift stores ever since my father abandoned us. It would break her heart if she knew just how much teasing I endured from the other members of the gang, but I loved her regardless.
Hi, my name is Sarah Buhrman, and I write gritty thriller type of urban fantasy.
I glanced back, but the streetlights and neon signs kept me from being able to see anything in the darker streets behind me. I headed down the sidewalk, walking quickly. I dodged around a group of people and darted across the two-lane, one-way street before the light changed. I now had a large, well-lit street full of people and vehicles between me and the monsters.
Hi, I'm Julia, also known as J.K. Allen when I'm writing, and I write primarily young adult urban fantasy. I'm also the president and head editor of Three Furies Press.
Jacob stopped at her cry, shouldering the black bag in his hand as if he hadn't a care in the world. He stood tall and proud, his black hair falling into his steel gray eyes. His strong jaw was set as he gave them a crooked smile, and he pulled out a black dagger with a low luster. Even Ginny knew that meant it was a demon blade, made of metal, poisonous to humans and angel-born.
And I'm Joe Compton, your host for Genres Urban Fantasy. This is kind of one of those genres that is interesting in that it's broad in its, but it has a specific definition. Though many consider it to be a subgenre of fantasy in which the narrative has magical rules or elements operating in an urban setting. Works of urban fantasy may be set in real world and introduce aspects of fantasy or in a fantasy world with operating rules recognizably similar to ours. Elements such as discovery of earthbound mythological creatures, coexistence, or conflict between humans and paranormal beings, and the changes such characters and events bring to local life are the mainspring. So how does everybody feel about that lovely definition of urban fantasy?
I think about the only thing it's missing is that it is technically a subgenre of contemporary fantasy, usually. So it's one of those things that it does kind of straddle at times, but I've always found that contemporary fantasy isn't really a big enough genre, so most contemporary fantasy ends up falling under urban fantasy, or they label it as urban fantasy.
That's the main thing to me, is that it's a label. 30 years ago, they weren't really labeling Clive Barker as urban fantasy, but most of his books from around that time definitely would fall under that purview now. And really, just going by the textbook definition, some stuff, going back to the Victorian era would probably fall under urban fiction. And as somebody who studies genres and I've taught classes and I write columns on it, that's kind of a common thing that happens with all of these labels, is that they're all something that it seems new and it fits now, but it's been around for a much longer time than anybody really recognizes.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Like I could see Dracula being misconstrued as an urban fantasy, or mislabeled maybe as an urban fantasy to a certain extent.
I actually think it's fairly accurate. One of the things a lot of people don't take into account is the historical aspects. And I think Dracula, in some respects, was a model of its time, but it's very easy to see why you could classify it as an urban fantasy if it was brought up to a modern setting.
Is that the key, that it has to be modern to who the reader is? I mean, because there's urban fantasy from the 70s. I wouldn't necessarily consider that modern anymore, right?
No, but it was for its time.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It comes under that contemporary fiction that Sarah was talking about. It basically comes up. You're looking at what's contemporary to the time it was released.
Well, I would even go so far as to say that, contemporary and urban fantasy could fall under any time period that's essentially post-industrial, because the way I look at genre labels is that it encompasses not just a series of checkboxes, but more of a feeling. And there's a certain feeling that you get from post-industrial societies versus medieval societies, or, prehistorical societies, or, things like that. It's the feeling of that setting.
Well, that's the thing, is it's urban fantasy. It's not rural fantasy. So it's got that element of city life and the grit and grime of cities. And my stories are set more in kind of suburbia than urban, but I definitely feel like you wouldn't want to have a rural setting.
So no Amish urban fantasy then, is that what we're saying, basically? With urban fantasy, curious, did you all set out with your particular offerings to this genre knowing that's the genre you were going in, or did you write it and it just fell into that category?
I knew.
I was actually specifically asked to write an urban fantasy.
Okay.
I'd been working on some horror stuff. I'd been working on some science fiction and a lot of crime stuff. And someone actually dared me to write an urban fantasy for a novella collection that was being put out. And that eventually turned into the novel Fur, which is kind of a noir meets urban fantasy meets gothic fiction.
Nice.
Yeah, I definitely set out to do urban fantasy. When I first started, I was actually writing or planning a novel, and it ended up being a whole pile of short stories so far, because the backstories wanted to get told before the actual novel did. So there's now 5 of those, and the novel's still sitting in the stages where I haven't hammered out the outline. But yeah, my wife was writing what's going to be the second book in the urban fantasy series, and I basically stole her character. So yes, it was very deliberate on my part.
Nice. How about for you, Julie?
I knew I wasn't writing epic fantasy. I knew I wasn't writing high fantasy, but I was a little confused about what actual genre label it fell under exactly, because there's paranormal, and I've heard some people use supernatural, and but for me, urban fantasy feels like the right thing to call it, because I don't want it to get confused with paranormal romance.
Yes.
Which is something that happens a lot. When people hear paranormal, they think automatically, oh, it's the woman in love with the vampire,
Yeah.
So urban fantasy definitely feels right for what I normally write.
So that being said, since you all somewhat planned it out or had some idea of where you were going with it, what are some of the things that you felt like you absolutely had to include in order for you to feel like this was part of this genre? So what are some of the things you planned out that you definitely knew you were going to have in there?
I started by knowing that it was going to be in Seattle because that's where my wife set hers. So one of the things I was very keen on doing was making sure it felt like Seattle itself, using some of the locations, some of the landmarks, having characters reference local events and stuff. That way it grounds it back in the setting itself.
For me, it was that whole like hidden world within our regular world that everyone knows about. I feel like that's a big part of urban fantasy, is like when you think of stepping into this new world that is like secret and has magic systems or has different creatures or races or however you want to label them, than what we think of when we think of our normal world, but that normal world is still there.
I wanted to try and marry some kind of disparate genres that don't get put together a lot. And so I was trying to come up with a way to start something out as an urban set, devolving mind kind of noir story, and then turn that into a supernatural story in the end. And then I decided to turn it into a gothic supernatural story. So it starts in the city, which, being noir, and one of the things that a lot of noir and urban fantasy have in common is that urban setting. So I definitely wanted to set it in the city, and there's a lot of back alleys and a lot of, talking about downtown, and a lot of description of the setting in the beginning. And then when it switches to that paranormal story, then things move out into the mountains in BC, and it turns into a gothic setting. But it was really important to me to use that urban setting to set it up as a noir, and then kind of divert expectations so that you didn't see the fantasy part coming.
I have a question that is kind of twofold. One, I want to know from you guys right off the bat, what tropes were you very, very aware of that you knew you were not going to include in your urban fantasy, that you were tired of seeing in other urban fantasies? And then, did your editor ever, or your publisher ever, decide that because you wanted to stick into the urban fantasy genre, of tailoring something that you really hoped would be in there, but ended up not being in there because it didn't fit with the urban fantasy lore and genre in itself?
I knew from the very beginning that it was going to be a female main character, and there was never going to be any hint of a love story. Ever. 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 She kills people, she don't kiss people.
Sounds like you and Julia had the same mindset.
Well, in mine, there's like a budding high school romance, but I definitely didn't make it the focus of the story. So, like, I knew for sure that this wasn't going to be a romance story, and it's very clean because it is young adult. And like I said, it's kind of that like first experience with a relationship, but like they don't even kiss till the end of the second book. So it's kind of like definitely not the main point.
I mean, Axel, you're breaking all kinds of barriers. So, did you have anything in mind that you were thinking about that you weren't going to include because you wanted it to kind of stand out?
Well, again, because I was trying to do those very specific genres to start with, I didn't want to include romance. I didn't want to have any kind of magic intruding on the setting in the beginning, because I wanted to really set it up as a psychological examination of this guy. He thinks he's losing his mind. I mean, basically, it's a werewolf story, but I wanted to examine the idea that, if that was actually happening to somebody in real life, they'd have no idea what was going on. They would just think they were losing their mind. And then once it turns out that that is actually what's happening, then that's what shifts the story. And so I was really cognizant of trying to stay away from letting things out of the bag too early, and keeping it really strictly dark and gritty and realistic in the first part of the book?
For me, it was trying to avoid the hero to the rescue, because anyone who's read any of my short stories knows that Richard is no hero.
So did any of you guys have any notes that were given to you or changes that were given to you by your editor or publisher to try and keep you on point within the genre that they felt like you were straying from it? Or did you guys all kind of stay within the lines to a certain extent?
Well, I'm going to start this one off because I'm possibly the oddball here. I actually edit and publish myself with feedback from
so did you tell yourself that you have no, Tim, you can't do this?
More a case of you've done this here, but you've got to be more sensitive about how you approached it. That's a plot point very early on in Under a Hunter's Moon, and anyone who's read any of my interviews probably knows just why I had to be sensitive about that one.
I was kind of making the line, so they just kind of let me do what I wanted to do and wanted to see how it turned out. But when that one was done, then they complained that there wasn't enough romance, and they wanted me to do a continuation. So now the next book and the series that springs off from it are all much more romance involved. But I wouldn't call it a paranormal romance, because it's still that's a subplot, not necessarily the drive of the story.
Urban fantasy kind of feels like my home genre, so I was never really overly concerned with tropes because I naturally stayed within that world and how that genre operates, as far as story plot and stuff like that. So the only time I really worried about tropes ever, I tried to write a steampunk story and I was like, what is this? So that's when I was worried about am I using the right tropes? Am I trying to introduce elements to the story that don't fit in steampunk? But like I said, urban fantasy is kind of my home genre. So I don't concern myself with staying in the lines.
I've never actually, I know what genre a story goes into, but I've never written a story to fit a genre. So, I write the stories. I write the stories that need to be written. And I kind of enjoy the fact that sometimes I'm going to make people get wiggy over the fact that I'm not following these specific tropes.
Right.
But if the story's good, the story's good. So, it may not be exactly what they expect, but, I guess I write to those people who like those funky little twists on the genres.
So, and I think you all fit that bill a little bit. You wouldn't be super creatives if you didn't, but what you all are. But so let's get into the magic of urban fantasy and some of the things that you are specifically concerned about or looking at when you're creating your system. How deep in detail do you go? How much do you reveal? Is there more to come? Are you looking at, because oftentimes with urban fantasy, most of you are all writing, in fact, you all are writing series or trilogies or something to that effect that are going to have multiple books. So are you holding on to certain things so that you can reveal them later? What is your approach to how you're putting together this magical system that incorporates your world?
I have two kinds of magical creatures, which are all based on actual myths. So I do a lot of research on the myths to find out what they can do, and a lot of extrapolation based on those myths. The other one is sort of a kind of pagan-y, Wiccan-y spells that are extremely subtle. And in fact, a lot of the times, they're not even a significant part of the story because they're more emotional manipulation and information divination, things like that, rather than, I always say the only fireballs that I create in my stories are ones that use gasoline.
Nice.
Yeah, I go for the big bang. I've got some pretty hefty magic going on in the system. There are some very toned down versions because there are specific things that the plot needs to attain. Sandy, right from the start, when she started writing the second book, had some pretty spectacular stuff happening. So it's out there. It's not necessarily always visible to the mortal world, but there's a lot of back plot we've built in to how the mythological creatures and paranormal races are actually tied to a given source. So, yes, there's a lot of stuff going on there.
Yeah, I was just gonna say, for mine, like, I don't do a huge ton of like conscious world building, but I do definitely figure out my magic systems, and I do research different types of magic. Like, my angels and demons use the angelic tongue, so they write sigils, and that's what works as magic for them. I have a djinn in the third book who uses a completely different type of magic. So I need to understand, like, who can use this magic, who can't, how does this magic operate, what are the limitations, what can it do exactly. But I definitely don't put that into the book because I don't want to info dump. And you do want to keep some of that, like, it's magic. The more, if you know too much about it, it doesn't feel as magical.
But it has a particular flavor because of who's using it.
Right. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
See, I kind of went the opposite way, and there's so much stuff out there already that's based, on biblical ideas. So, like, my next book has demons in it, so I wanted to go back, kind of pre-Christian, and look at the myths that feed into those Christian ideas, and use like Eastern European myths and traditions for that. And then I did a lot of research into different magic systems, but different mythology from around the world, and I like to try and weave that in where I can. So there's a lot of research.
Let's everybody pull out their soapbox and stand on it and tell me one thing you really, really are tired of with the urban fantasy genre, or tired of hearing, maybe even.
There's a reason why I don't ever write those like invincible characters, because it's like, if you know who's going to win in the end, why would you bother reading the story? And nobody's perfect, so that character that's picks up a bow and arrow, and 5 minutes later all they can shoot is bullseyes, and they're an amazing fighter even though they've never had any training, and they're fighting against people who have been doing this for years. Like, those kind of characters are just like, they kill me a little bit inside. Like, I die inside every time I read one of those like type of characters, and it's like, that's the protagonist, and it's just like, I can't, it's not realistic. It's boring. And like I said, they're going to win in the end. So it's like, what's the point of me watching them be perfect for 200 pages?
As a publisher, I'll say, with any of the genres, it always happens is, people falling into those cliche wells, and they're just aping whatever's popular. So, right now, specific to urban fantasy, it's, Harry Dresden style, hard-boiled-ish detectives, and, Laurel Hamilton style, badass chick vampire hunters and things like that. And it gets to a point where if you're going to do it and you do it properly, great. But there's so many things out there where people just kind of, they're writing fan fiction, but they're publishing it as something new. Do something new, push the boundaries, and try and create something new and unique that's not already out there.
Going to go with the alpha males, the strong, solid shifter males who literally can't seem to do anything wrong.
Yeah.
Get rid of them, because we're all fallible.
I was hoping that you guys would cut down my list. Well, I guess the big one would be people who go through some really hardcore stuff and brush it off. And nobody explores people are doing it a little bit more these days, but a couple of years ago, nobody was exploring like PTSD after you have a near-death experience with a vampire or something. Like, dude, your entire worldview just shattered, and you're just like, meh, it's another Saturday. It drives me nuts. These people should be in therapy. So put them in therapy. Seriously.
Yeah. I'll go one step further with mine. Misunderstood pack dynamics. If you study wolves in the wild, they do not have a alpha male who is basically the strongest.
So, why urban fantasy? What is so attractive about urban fantasy that you guys love? And I know, Axel, you were asked to do it, but you didn't have to do it if you didn't want to. So obviously, you wanted to try it. So why try it? Why do you guys enjoy urban fantasy as a genre?
It's definitely in my wheelhouse, and kind of modern urban fantasy. I think you can trace back to like Kolchak the Night Stalker, and things like that, and that's absolutely my jam. X-Files monster episodes, supernatural stuff like that. I like big mythologies, and I like things that pull in cultural touchstones and use them in a new way. So that was always really appealing to me. Urban fantasy, somewhere you can do that you can't do it as much in other subgenres.
Yeah, I would say I like the pulling from mythology aspect of it as well, and also that it's not really super concerned with aesthetics. Like, it's not about what the characters wear. It's not about how things look when you walk into a room, and it's more just like the story. And I love that kind of everyday magic, that there's like this whole world that's full of amazing things that like we don't see until we look beyond our surface world,
Yeah, I like the fact I'm a city boy at heart, but the urban fantasy allows me to ground a real story with real people in a setting that everyone understands and knows well enough that I don't have to go through huge description and literally trying to define the world that they're living in. It gives you a lot more freedom to explore.
I like the fact that, particularly with modern settings, you have, we have a society right now where you have more freedom of personal self-expression than ever before. I mean, you had to follow fashion trends in Victorian England, or else you were a social outcast. You had, gender norms throughout the ages, things like that. We are entering a time where it is widespread that these issues are becoming less stringent, and people have this kind of feeling that it's harder to find yourself because there's not a script. And applying that to a fantasy setting is just, to me, it is a well that will never run dry. Exploring one's own personal, unique self in a fantasy setting in a way that challenges people, but at the same time, you get the pop culture references, which I love.